Welcome back to our Through the Bible study. If you could turn to Genesis chapter 27, we're going to pick up where we left off, concluding the life and legacy of Isaac. Now, Isaac, his life was far from over. In fact, he was going to live for about another 43 years after this event. But in conclusion to where we left off in the last study, with Isaac's life and legacy being almost a copy and paste repeat of Abraham's, and that how we relate to a God who loves us, takes care of us, protects us, and provides for us all in our own ways, even though at times we aren't necessarily as obedient, trusting, or faithful. God loves us because he's so loving, not because we're so lovable. And that's encouraging news, especially on my part. But when we get into chapter 27, the last impact that Isaac left on the lives of his sons actually caused, well, kind of a rift in the family, and would result in what we're going to be talking about today, the majority of Jacob's legacy, and how his life would be a reflection of not only how God dealt with his dad, but his grandpa as well. And the repeating promise was consistent with, well, verbatim what God told him it would be. So in verses 1 through 27, and I just want to go over these with you in hindsight and overview, I want to encourage you to read this on your own time. 3 chapters, not too much to ask. But in chapter 27 through 30, in which we're going to be going over today, the first 27 verses are essentially how Jacob cheated his older brother Esau. And that goes by his name, right? His name meant heel catcher, the guy who holds his hand out when he's running, or grabs at the heel when the guy's getting farther ahead. His name means cheater, so naturally he'd follow his character and namesake to the letter. But just like we're going to see in the next study about how God calls us out of our old identities and names and into a new life, that his name and future identity would be Israel, one governed by God, we see that God can use just as much our mistakes and our shortcomings to his goodness, as much as the times when we're banging on all our cylinders, which is encouraging also to know, because let's be honest, we find ourselves more in the former than the latter. But in this, Esau and Jacob essentially have this switcheroo as far as who's going to get the birthright. For those of you who were here in our previous study, in chapter 25, verses 29 through 34, it discusses the whole story about how Jacob got this in word and in writing from Esau. But knowing the big brother mentality, he could just go back on a bet he lost and say, yeah, you caught me in a moment, you fed me some chili. I don't frankly care anymore about that right now. If you want my birthright, you're going to have to take it from my sword and spear. So Jacob essentially usurps Esau by setting up a scenario and situation, in fact with the help of his mother, which we'll go into in a second. But noting that Isaac obviously wasn't clued in on this deal in exchange, that he obviously favored Esau more, as the Bible tells us, he sends him out to get him some medicine, where verbatim he says, he calls for his son, he couldn't see. Obviously he didn't have cataract surgeries back then, so vision was fading, he was bedridden and invalid, and around, based off of what we could do from the numbers of the dates that we have beforehand, 137 years old at this time. Now, he would live to be 180, and that's a long time to be bedridden and blind. But noting there was an important detail to that fact that we'll discuss in future studies, and I'll just summarize it for you here. It would be so that Isaac wouldn't have to die knowing that his family was split up. He'd get to see Esau and Jacob work out their differences. But today we're discussing how those differences started, not just noting the conflicting personalities between an older and younger brother, let alone twins. If any of you guys have interacted, my mother and uncle are in fact fraternal twins, boy and girl, and I mean, even at the age that they're at now, it's entertaining. But with that in mind, he sends him out to go hunting, get him some venison, so he can have a full belly, where he literally tells him that I may eat and that my soul may bless you before I die. So obviously he's planning on it, but God has different plans. And Rebekah was listening in when Isaac spoke to Esau, and when Esau went out, obviously you'd remember back in chapter 25, verse 23, when Rebekah was pregnant with Jacob and Esau, and they were squabbling in the oven as much as out in the bakery. She asked God, why is this happening to me? And God responded to her and saying, 2 nations are in your womb, but the older will serve the younger. She remembered this promise and prophecy by God, and was for all intents and purposes willing to help Jacob out on this. No, what they were going to do was sneaky, crude, and wrong, but it was also in alignment with what God's plan was for their lives. And he would be the one to work all of this out. Note, I have no doubt that if probably Rebekah had informed Isaac and he had denied it, then he'd have God to deal with. This could have been sorted out in much more simpler ways. But this would also set up circumstances where then Jacob would also get to meet his wife, or wives, actually. We'll get into it in the study in a little bit, but that's a hilarious story. And on top of that, she's essentially saying, go and take one of the animals from the flock. And she says, I'll cook it up like Esau does, just really in haste, really straightforward. I know the way that Isaac likes his meat, so obviously I'm going to make this. He's not going to tell the difference. And Jacob's like, well, there's one more biological feature overlooking. I mean, sure, you can imitate Esau's cooking, probably more so and better. Sure, you can convince him, like, I can make my voice sound like my older brother. I've been practicing it for well, we'll talk about how old he was at this time, and that's a whole other joke. But I've been practicing it for like 30 years, and we had been figuring this out. Rebecca said, well, bring me the camel skin, and I'll wrap your arms with it. So literally, it was no joke why Esau's name was Harry any more than Jacob's name was Cheater, because he lived for cheating. Esau was literally Chewbacca incarnate. So he said, when your dad comes to feel you and say, oh, is this my son? And he feels literally like the hide of a camel. Oh, yeah, that's Esau. All right, let me pray over you. I'll pass you the family blessing. The Bible's painfully honest, and it's so much fun. But going on to verse 27, they set this whole thing up, and she just says, I got this. I know what my husband will fall for. I know how to get this sorted out. This is what God wants for you. And this is, let's be frank and honest, what Esau already agreed to in exchange for that soup you gave him a while back. So noting all of these factors being thrown in together, let's just get this done. So I don't want to lie about this to my dad and saying, we'll work it out. So going all the way down to verse 27, she wraps him in camel's hair. She makes him smell like Esau. I can only imagine how that process was accomplished. Cooks him some venison, comes back, and essentially the response is, well, that was fast. And Jacob's like, well, the Lord favored me on my journey, so here you go, Dad. And he eats, and the funny part is in verse 27, he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his clothing, and blessed him, saying, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field, which the Lord has blessed. Therefore my God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and of plenty of grain and wine. Let the people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. Again, a repeat of what God's blessing was to Abraham, passed on to Isaac, and now being passed on to Jacob. This is how the family legacy would fall to Israel. Now, with this repeat and emphasis on the point, the blessing to Jacob is valid. That God would provide for him, that he'd have the plenty of the earth, that he would have authority, that a king would pass through his family lineage, the King of Kings, in fact. And as well, those who are against him are against God, and those who are with him are with God. So naturally, a blessing and a cursing to those who are against the children of Israel. Note that, in fact, when you consider your role in politics. Now, after all of these events happened, actually, I'll just read what the Bible says. Now it happened, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of his father. So literally, this is almost like a cartoon-esque situation. He had just made off with a blessing. He comes out of the tent, and Esau is already carrying in the deer, and he's like, what's that little shrimp doing? He walks in. And Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also had made savory food, and brought it in to his father. And he said to his father, let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your soul may bless me. His father Isaac said to him, who are you? And so he said, I'm your son, your firstborn, Esau. Then Isaac trembled exceedingly. He was freaking out like, oh no. Heel catcher. This fist and everything. Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I had ate of it before you came and have blessed him, and indeed he shall be blessed. So note, repeat on the point. This was a valid handing off of the blessing. And Esau heard the words of his father. He cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me also, O my father. But he said, Your brother came in with deceit, and has taken away your blessing. Esau said, He's not rightly named Jacob, cheater, heel catcher, for he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, now he has taken away my blessing. And he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me? Isaac answered and said to Esau, Indeed, I have made him your master, and all his brethren have given to him as servants. With grain and wine I have sustained him. What shall I do for you now, my son? And Esau said to his father, Have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Now, in Hebrews, when we get into the Old Testament, goes into an emphasis about Esau being essentially on the wrong side of his heart when he sought repentance. And that the important thing to consider is not only what you're doing when you come to God asking for forgiveness and restoration from a mistake, but why? Are you doing it because you have to face the consequences? Or are you doing it because you actually understand what you did was stupid, and now you want to restore your relationship with God? That's why when God notes his relationship with Esau to Isaac, he said, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. That even though he was doing manipulative and underhanded methods, his goal and his purpose, whether it was inspiration from his mom or not, was to accomplish God's will. That he had already been established and raised under this upbringing from his mom. He was the mama's boy of the family. And naturally so, because God had spoken over her the promise that Jacob would be used to be served in this way. And this is going to be consistent throughout Scripture. It's not the first person born that's the most important. It's the one with the right character that God can use. And oftentimes God uses the worst of us to accomplish the best things. If you don't believe me, look at David. When we get into Samuel, 1 Samuel, we see David's better side, but 2 Samuel, not so much. And that's the good thing about the Bible. It shows its heroes, warts and all. But with that in mind, we get also an insight into Esau's blessing, where he says, Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. I'm going to bless you. You're going to have a lot going for you. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke, which was a secure harness for oxen to carry burdens. If you guys watch My Little Pony, Big Mac is always carrying that wooden necklace, that collar. That's what a yoke is. It's meant to be used for working in farm animals. But you shall break his yoke from your neck. So essentially what's being spoken over Esau's life is that God would provide for him, and in abundance. He was of the family that God was going to use in a powerful way. So naturally, God, being the generous God that he was, loves to bless his children, despite how on uncertain terms their hearts would be with him. But knowing that the calling of his life would be a legacy of violence, this wasn't necessarily a blessing, it was just a prophecy of what his nature would be. For a time, he'd serve Jacob, but not long after that happens, he'd eventually become their enemy. And we know from history that the Edomites died with Herod the Great during the time of Jesus. And if you know the 4 Herods of the New Testament, going from Matthew all the way to Acts, they were pretty violent people. And you also know that, just like we talked about with the minor prophets coming up beyond Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the minor prophets weren't minor in that their message was lesser, but they were just smaller books. One of the minor prophets is actually just taking the entire time to cuss out Edom and tell him, man, God has a lot coming to you, and I hope you guys wake up before it gets there. In fact, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah all have very strong things to say to Edom when they are giving Israel the trouble that they commonly would. In fact, the reason, when we get into Exodus, the reason why they couldn't go straight into the Promised Land, in fact, was because the Edomites wouldn't let them through. We'll get more details about that in Numbers. But with this legacy of violence that would be spoken over Esau, Verse 41 essentially says, it didn't take long for that time where he served Jacob to transpire and pass. So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Now, we know from hindsight in history, Jacob would live for a very long time. That's probably why God let Isaac live for such a long time as an invalid. He wouldn't let Esau essentially, you remember Edom means red, that was his nickname. He'd let the red skin of his face die down a little bit, which actually ended up taking over 20 years before he'd finally just let this matter go and trusted that what God had given him was enough. And we'll discuss that briefly in chapter 36. But he said, once my dad's dead, I'm going to kill him. And so essentially day by day, as his dad was coughing in the tent, he'd just look over at Jacob, he'd be sharpening his spear with a rock and saying, like, I may as well just write your name into this thing because you know where it's headed. Now, the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. Mom got wind of this. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise, and flee to my brother Laban. That would be his uncle, knowing that Rebekah and Laban, they were taken by the chief servant of Abraham, Eli, to be brought as a wife for Isaac in the chapters that we discussed past, saying, go hang out with my brother Laban. Obviously, there's been a lot of money going that way. He'll take care of you. He has a good business. They're a good home. They're a good people. That's why I was brought here, frankly. And we're going to find out in a little bit that Laban actually had a lot in common with Jacob, so they would get along. And also other things would end up working out as well according to God's plan. But Laban would be living in Haran, so he said, stay with them a few days until your brother's fury turns away. It would be more than a few days. But until your brother's anger turns away and he forgets what you have done to him, I will send and bring you from there. And why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day? And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth, like those who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? And we'll go a little bit more details into this when we get later on to the chapters. But essentially, Esau married Phlusis. And I say that plural, by the way. One more mistake just compounded to another. And nothing's worse for a mom than for her boy to bring home a lousy girl, and vice versa. So not only knowing that Esau had poor judgment as to how to make decisions on an empty stomach concerning his birthright, but also very poor timing as far as when to leave a note and be so predictable in odor and appearance that they would be able to fool his dad like that. But essentially, Rebekah's intent to send him to Laban would be for the same reason that Abraham sent his servant to go fetch a bride for Isaac. That we're going to see, I'll emphasize and explain, but Rebekah sends Jacob off so that he can find a good wife in a good town. What better place than where she grew up? And essentially, Jacob is going to end up marrying his first cousin. But understand that biology and human anatomy, as far as their aging and reproductive capabilities, were a lot different than they are today than they were back then. The reason why first cousin marrying is gross and a hillbilly practice to us today is because of not only just the moral implications, but those morals actually were founded in Exodus because of the principle that at that point in human history, the human genome had been so diversified that then, once again, intermarrying between a close blood relative with between 4 or 5 generations would actually dramatically escalate birth defect risks, and God didn't want that for his people. So he said, don't marry very, very close relatives. Just stay within the children of Israel, because I don't want you marrying Phlusis either. And Rebekah is just essentially saying, look, if you get a girl from this town, I'm going to kill myself because this is too much. I want you to go and find a good girl, and I want you to wait until your brothers calmed down and turned less red. That's why they called him Edom, most likely, on top of the fact that he sold his birthright for red soup. But anyway, in chapter 28, Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, and charged him, saying to him, You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan-aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take for yourself a wife there from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. Now, before we get into the blessing, it might take a little bit of the romance out of this situation to inform you that this was so funny. Jacob is now 77 years old, and he's getting ready to run away from home. Emphasis on the part I said before about the fact that the human anatomy worked differently than it did back then. He was still fertile, and he was still in his very young years. Again, Isaac would live to be almost 200. And noting that before the time of the flood, people were living almost to be 1,000. So noting the atmospheric conditions were deteriorating even back then, it's not because of carbon emissions. It's just because this planet's dying. And just like our bodies, it's less capable of supporting itself than it used to be in the fresher days of its time. So, with that in mind, Jacob is blessed by Isaac, made good on his promise and spiritual blessing, and saying, once again, may God Almighty bless you, and make you fruitful and multiply you. May you have lots of kids, that you may be an assembly of peoples. And to give you the blessing of Abraham, to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. Again, you remember that prophecy spoken over him, that he not only predicted that you would dwell in a land that is not yours, that the Canaanites would end up having to give up their land for you because of the way that they were just brutalizing each other through pagan practices and just monstrous acts that are actually defining our world once again today. But also predicting that for 400 years, I believe, I'll go back and check this in a future date. When we start Exodus, I'll reconfirm. But they would live in Egypt, but then be taken out of captivity and brought into a land of freedom. That God even saw that coming and was still intending to show a plan for it. So, verse 5, Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan-aram, to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Syrian, the brother of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob and Esau. So, as much as the romance was taken away from the fact that he's 77 years old, we do get into something cute here, in that how he gets the attention of his soon-to-be wife is just showing off his guns, which is classic dude factor. I mean, he was less... what's the word? He wasn't as manly man as his older brother Esau, but that by no means meant that he was a scrawny little effeminate flower either. Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob, sent him away to Padan-aram. Oh wait, before we get into that, this is hilarious. Isaac saw Isaac left to go to marry a wife, and that he blessed him to give him charge, saying, You shall not take from yourself a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Esau's listening to that. It's like, oh, my mom and dad don't like the Canaanite brides we married because we live here. So, Esau saw the daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. I have to explain. The Bible did it for me. So Esau went to Ishmael, note his grandpa's brother, and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife in addition to the wives he had. Now, we'll go more into this in a future verse in this study, but essentially Esau is just playing the copycat at this point. He's totally had all of his credibility and power in the family taken away from him and sent off to live with his uncle. And he's saying like, oh, we're doing that now? Well, if you want Jacob to marry the relatives and you don't like my wives, well, maybe I should marry one of my relatives too. So he goes to Ishmael, the rebellious member of the family, and the whole reason why the Canaanites were the way they were, Ishmael was also heading that direction with his family line and lineage, which we discussed in brief passing when we discussed his family and genealogy as to why these names made sense. You don't have to know or recognize them, but just note and remember that the same reason as why Noah's flood had to happen was because godly people kept marrying ungodly spouses and led them away from God. Esau thinks, oh, well, if I want to make it better with my folks, how about I just marry another sleazy girl, but she just happens to be married to my grandpa, and just... thick skull. Anyway, verse 10. Now we'll get into the cute part where Jacob woos over Rebekah. Going on to verse 22. Now Jacob went out from Beersheba, went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there all night, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it on his head. And he lay down in that place to sleep. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there the angel of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give you and your descendants, and also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. He's repeating his promises that he made to Abraham. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south, and in you, in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed, referring to Jesus Christ eventually being called through them. That's why they were blessed more than any other nation, not because God loved them more, but he would use them in a more powerful way than any of us could claim. Just like Mary. It wasn't that she was a goddess, but she was blessed among women more than any other woman in history because she would be used to bring the Messiah into this world. Something that only one person could claim, just like only one nation could claim to be the nation of the Messiah. So, behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob arose early in the morning, took the stone which he had put at his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of the place Bethel. Now, this will be important that he needs to come back here later. We'll discuss in a future study why not obeying God's commands to the letter is a bad idea. Hashtag Dinah. You can look that up later. Anyway, but the name of the city had been Luz previously, so we can know geographically what it used to be and why it was renamed Bethel. This would be on the western half of the Jordan River towards when Joshua came in from Canaan. It would be near Jericho and also one of the cities of refuge that would be used to enact their legal system, which we'll discuss when we get into Joshua. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Then the stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and that all you give me I will surely give a tenth to you. Jacob was a slow learner. And the reason why this sounds spiritual but isn't is because essentially Jacob's saying, well, God, if you do such and such for me, then I'll serve you, and I'll even give a tenth of all that I have to you. And you could imagine God's up there saying, well, I own 100% of it anyway, but I appreciate the gesture. I'm your God because I chose to be, but thanks, I guess. I mean, you can imagine the way that people view God is like, I'll strike you with lightning. This would be a lightning striking moment if God wasn't so good, patient, loving, and merciful to someone who's making this arrogant claim at saying, you can be my God if you do such and such for me. And God's like, I was planning on it anyway, so I'll let that go. But this place, Bethel, was essentially where he had the vision known as Jacob's ladder. And that's where we get that phrase coming from. The path to heaven, angels would be ascending and descending by this one way, this one decision as far as how they reached God, and it was only one direction, up. And that ladder we would then recognize, once again, when we get into Hebrews. The Old Testament is just peppered with it, so you're going to want to study it regularly if you're going to actually even think about reading that book. Otherwise it won't make any sense. But when it emphasized the blessing of Jacob and that vision that he was given, Essentially, this whole situation was meant to remind Jacob, look, I'm with you, I'm for you, I'm going to take care of you. You were in the worst place possible. I mean, it's like when you're nauseous and have that stomach flu virus and you just want to lay on top of the toilet seat lid and it's just so comfortable and cool and you're just like, oh, why don't I do this more often? It's so comfortable. Because you're in a horrible situation, any comfort and peace is helpful. That's why he was using a rock as a pillow. But being kicked out of home, headed to a place he'd never been, involving with family, and not even sure when he's going to find his wife, but when, and knowing that Isaac had to wait a while for his kids, and the same for Abraham in Magnus. He was approached by God and reminded, I'm going to take care of you. Now, no, Jacob would forget this a lot. That's why God had to remind him a lot. And that's why it's important to read your Bibles, because we need reminding a lot. We have that much in common with Jacob, or at least I do. If you're holier than me, then congratulations. But when we get to Jacob's ladder passage, it was just an emphasis on the point that, well, the reason why he built a pillar was to even remind himself. And that's an important thing to note. Jacob could remember places better than pictures, and a lot of us can remember words better than faces. It's important to recognize and remember God and how he's interacted with you, not necessarily your parents or your grandpa, because he had heard the blessing probably, well, we've heard it like 3 times at this point. But Jacob's essentially saying, how do I know God's going to bless me? And he said, remind yourself by that rock, knowing that I met you here. And he said, that actually makes sense. So, chapter 29. This is when we get into the passage where Jacob woos his wife. I apologize, alluding to that. So, the first 10 verses here. Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And he looked, and he saw a well in the field, and behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks, and a large stone was on the well's mouth. Now all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. Essentially a lid to make sure they weren't doing the shenanigans that we remember from Abraham and Abimelech. They had thought it through. And Jacob said to them, my brethren, where are you from? And they said, we're from Haran. He's like, hot dog, I'm here. So he said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, yeah, we know him. So he said to them, is he well? That's important. And they said, he's well, and look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. God's funny like this. He just lets everything fall into place once you get there. Same thing with Rebecca, but cuter. Anyway, so he said, look, it is still high day, and it is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them. But they said, we cannot till all the flocks are gathered together. And they have rolled the stone from the well's mouth, then we water the sheep. So essentially this rock was so big, massive, and heavy that the only way they could get it off is if everyone had gotten there at once, and you could have all 5 or 10 men push it at once. But then Jacob shows up, being the very fit and set 77-year-old man that he was. And while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep that Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near, ready, and he rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So it's like, we can't roll the stone until all the 10 guys get here, so it's really rough. And then Jacob's like, oh, he's talking with them, and then, who's that girl walking down the street that kind of like to meet? Let me know if you get that reference to that song, but she's purty. So he's like, oh, this well? Oh, I got it. And he just by himself pushes the whole thing off and said, hey, bring up your sheep. He's totally showing off. I think it's cute. But verse 11, then Jacob kissed Rachel, lifted up his voice, and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative, and that he was Rebekah's son. Now, no, this is not grounds for dating now. This was cute then. So he ran and told her father. Literally, repeat scenario of what his dad went through with Isaac. That's how he could know that God would provide for him. He already had before. God doesn't ask you to trust him with something he hasn't already done. And if you do, you get major props for it. So then it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him, embraced him and kissed him, and brought him to his house. So he told Laban all these things, and Laban said to them, "Surely you're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And he stayed with him for a month. So Laban, being the savvy businessman that he was, the reason why he was all too eager to give away his sister Rebekah to the chief servant Eli to get married to Isaac in the previous verses that we talked about, he remembers that the reason why, well, remember the giant nose ring and the bracelets all weighing various considerable measurements. And he's like, this family's got money. Of course you're welcome in my house. Anyway. Yeah, verse 15. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder, the older sister, was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Now, Leah's eyes, verse 17, were delicate. Another translation would put that as weak. But Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Another translation would put she had a very nice figure. Now, this phrase, delicate or fragile or weak eyes, essentially means she wasn't easy on the... I mean, I'm sure she had a great personality, but that's essentially what's being talked about here. Actually, I want to recommend you this. If you want to get more detail into this passage and probably laugh your heart out doing it as so, and probably change your life as far as how you view relationships, I recommend go to FreshLifeChurch.com and listen to Levi Lusko's study on this passage and what we're going to talk about here next. The name of the study is The Babe, the Box, and the Blood, under the subtitle sermon series Save the Date Part 2. And note, the title is odd, but the study is hilarious and also very edifying and biblically consistent. So I encourage you to read that to go into more details about this. But Leah's not so easy on the eyes. Rachel rather, is. So, Jacob loved Rachel. I wonder why. So he said, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." And Laban said, "Well, it's better I give her to you than I should give her to another man, so stay with me." So now this is where it gets pretty romantic, and then not so much later. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. That's when we all go, "Aww." But then verse 21 happens. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her." He's a guy. What can you do? So, verse 22, Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So kind of a wedding present. I don't know why that's included in there, but let's just rewind a little bit and say, what? He got married to Rachel, but then his dad, his now father-in-law and uncle, pulled the old switcheroo. Sound familiar? The cheater just got cheated, and his wife that he was serving for got switched with the ugly stepsister, and he consummated the marriage with her. Now, how on earth do you get married to one person and then go to the honeymoon suite without the other, without being a total scumbag in the process? Well, this does not sound like the behavior of a sober individual. And note that in Hebrew culture, consistent with how things worked back then, they didn't just have weddings, they had wedding feasts, and there was likely an open bar. And when the night had passed, Jacob was probably hammered, because this is not the behavior of someone sober. So when we get into verse 25, it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob goes, and he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Why was it not Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? No!" So Laban essentially cheats the cheater and says this. He said, "It must not be done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week," the marital rites, the honeymoon, "and we will give you this one also for the service that you will serve me still another 7 years." So he just cheats Jacob after saying, "Oh, you want this wife? Well, here's the ugly big sister. And then I'll give you the pretty younger sister if you serve me another 7 years for free." And essentially this was the dowry. Dowry was, back in that culture, women had no rights. There was no prenuptial agreements, equal division of the resources. If you wanted to marry a girl, your responsibility to the father was to pay him alimony in advance. So that if you were a jerk and chickened out on the marriage or treated her wrong and she left, that she would just basically be destitute, except for the fact that you would then have the alimony that you gave to her father, so that when she get home, she would essentially live off that for the rest of her life. And Laban essentially saying, "How about 7 years labor?" And he swindles 2 for the price of 1. Now, the Bible does not condone polygamy. It acknowledges that this was the scenario. And by far, this was not Jacob's intention. But Jacob did so, verse 28, "and fulfilled her week. And so he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid." A little wedding gift, I suppose. You get a servant. "Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah." Again, I wonder why. "And he served with Laban still another year." Now, verse 31 and onward into the end of the chapter 29, it emphasizes the point that God did not approve that, well, first off, this scenario had to happen, but that Jacob was playing favorites. "And the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, so he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." Now, in that culture, it was a curse if you couldn't have kids, because girls, you've come a long ways, thanks to Jesus, in regards to how you are valued and acknowledged as equal human beings. That it was Paul the Apostle who laid down the law 3 times in the New Testament, that we are to treat you fairly, that we are to treat you as we treat ourselves, and that we're to love you like Christ loves us. But back then, it was essentially the one thing you have above us in that culture was you can have kids. So if you can have a lot of kids, you are worth that much more to us. Now note, some guys were better at expressing this than others. There were scumbags, just like there are today, and there were good men, like there still are today. But God didn't approve that Jacob was essentially playing his lot and saying, "Well, now that I'm finished my obligation with you, Leah, I don't have to bother with you anymore." So essentially, God makes Leah, in compensation for not getting her marital rights to be loved and taken care of by her husband, God says, "Okay, you're going to be having kids, and Rachel, the one who gets all the attention, isn't going to profit him anything." So Leah conceived, verse 32, bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, "The Lord has surely looked on my affliction." That's what his name is. "Now, therefore, my husband will love me." Then she conceived again and born a son, and said, "Because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he therefore has given me this son also." And he named his name Simeon, which means heard. And again, Reuben means see, a son. "And she conceived again and born a son, and said, Now by this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi." Now, Levi means attached. "And she conceived again and born a son," verse 35, "and said, Now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, which means praise. Then she stopped bearing." So these kids, the reason why it leaves off chapter 29 with Judah as the last and most significant was because Judah would be the lineage that Jesus would end up coming through. That God would fulfill his promises through Leah, not Rachel. But this is where it gets funny, and for time's sake, I'll just go over this. Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, so Rachel envied her sister. and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel and said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld you from the fruit of the womb?" It's just like, that's not my department, girl. I can definitely contribute to the process, but he's the one that makes it work. Fill in the blanks as far as what you don't know about that. But so he said, "Here's my maid Bildah." Oh, crud, not this again. "Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Then she gave him Bildah as her maid, as his wife. Jacob went into her. Bildah conceived, bore Jacob a son, and Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Now, consistent with how Ishmael came into the world, Dan would not be the most favorable of the children of Israel when it came into the future. Reuben was psychotic, but Dan and which one was it? It was Ephraim. Were actually, in Revelation chapter 7, the two tribes of Israel that were omitted from God's plan in sharing the gospel to the world during the time of the Great Tribulation. So naturally this was consistent with this being a bad idea. Rachel's maid conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." So he named his name Naphtali. That means wrestling. And by the way, Dan means judge. Then Leah saw that she had stopped bearing. She took Zilpah, her maid. Why? And gave Jacob his wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "A troop comes." And so she called his name Gad. Then Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son and said, "I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed." So she called his name Asher. Now Reuben, this is just all kinds of messed up, went in the days of the wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the fields, a natural aphrodisiac back then. They didn't have, what's the word? They didn't have Viagra and those kind of things, so naturally you take all the help you can get from nature. And she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away?" Oh wait, I skipped some there. He brought in the mandrakes from the harvest and brought them into his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your mandrakes, your son's mandrakes." And she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you also take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." Oh my gosh. Then Jacob, verse 16, came out of the field in the evening. Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. You never hear Jacob complaining about this, but let's just consider this like, what would it be? Rule 10,400 or 512. As to why polygamy is a bad idea for situations like this, that literally an older sister and a younger sister go sibling rivalry in grabbing their husbands having kids. And there's like, "I can have more kids than you," and it's like, "No, you can't. I got 5 and you have none." It's like, "Fine, take my maid." And Jacob's like, "Okay, I'm going this way now." And oh my gosh, is the Bible honest or what? So, good grief. Verse 17, God listened to Leah, and she conceived, great, and bore Jacob a 5th son. And Leah said, "God has given me my wages, since I have my maid, and given my maid and my husband." So she called his name Issachar. Then Leah conceived again, and bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So he called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah. Now note, she is one of likely many that are mentioned, and the reason why this is, and why other daughters aren't mentioned, isn't because Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. He likely had many others, just like Isaac likely had many other sons and daughters, but the focus was on Jacob and Esau. The focus was on Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac, because remember, he had 5 other kids after his wife died. Or actually more than that. You guys can look back in the study. I don't remember right now, but she has conceived and born a son, and said, "God has taken away my..." Oh, hold on. After Dinah, God remembered Rachel. That's important. Different woman. I have no idea why this is a thing, but different woman, same husband. God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son, and God has taken away my reproach. Again, it was a cultural insult. This would be the first baby that she would bear to Jacob. And she called his name Joseph. Remember that name, because just like Dinah will be important in the next following chapters, Joseph will be extremely important because he'll be a living example of Jesus Christ. Now, she said, "The Lord shall add to me another son." And the reason why this was, of course, was because he will add is what Joseph means. So, we'll finish the chapter with this, but verses 25 through 43 onward, God obviously not approving of that whole baby blitz thing, but when Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and my own country. Give me my wives, my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service which I have done for you." And Laban said to him, "Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes. For I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. I love having you around. God's with you for the same reason that Abimelech wanted Abraham around." And we're starting to see another living example of not only setting up the situation with the polygamy mistake, but also God worked in spite of it, not because of it. No, polygamy is not approved by God in the Bible. It is emphasized. God intended one man, one woman for life. But just like Jacob is one mistake after another, just like we are one mistake after another, he can work in spite of our mistakes. Doesn't mean there's not consequences for it. We just discussed that plain enough. It's like, my son found an aphrodisiac. It's like, well, can I sleep with my husband if I buy them from you? And it's like, good grief, what is this going on here? He wants to keep Jacob around because he knows that he will be a blessing. Jacob wants to go home and see his mom and dad before they die. Laban says, "Well, you know that I've served you." Jacob says rather, "You know, I've served you and how your livestock have been with me, for what I had and what I came with was little, but has increased a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now shall I go and provide for my own house." So he said, Laban, "What shall I give you?" And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything, for if you do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs. So just the white and plain ones are yours. I'll take all the oddballs. And those shall be my wages from among the goats and the lambs. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes up before you, every one that is not speckled and spotted, I can't cheat with this. And you're not going to cheat me either, because frankly, Jacob is not playing shortcomings with his uncle at this point because of what he pulled with Leah. So among the brown of the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. So Laban said, "Oh, that it were according to your word." So they strike hands and they agree. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, the female goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white on it, and all the brown ones of the lambs, and he gave them into the hand of his sons. So these were all Jacob's property, and naturally the babies that would naturally be born this way, something that neither of them could control. Let's just say, luck of the dice. When new lambs come in, you get the striped and speckled, I get the spotted and the brown. And we'll discuss next week how Laban actually changed this process 7 times, and I'll tell you why. Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar from the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips from them, and exposed the white that was in the rods. And the rods that which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, and the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. Now, those of you guys who play Minecraft, you remember the cows have babies when you feed 2 of them, and then they come together and they're kissing with the love things, and then a baby one comes out. Same principle, but a little different in the process. Jacob separated the lambs, made the flocks face toward the street, and all the brown of the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves, and did not put them with Laban's flock. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they may conceive above the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them with him, so the feeble were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and he had large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys. So in conclusion to chapter 30 and all of this that was going on after that whole ordeal, what's being talked about here isn't like some sort of old-fashioned genetics breeding technique where he said, oh, when the animals are eating and they have full stomachs, they'll want to mate. So since I'm getting paid with all the striped ones, then when the babies, or when the parents rather, are eating, I'll show them striped plants as they're mating so that they'll have striped babies. And then when the wages are changed and I'm told that I get the spotted or the brown, I'll show them chestnuts and they'll just associate brown as they're mating, and that way their babies will be brown. That's not how genetics works. God just acknowledges that this was Jacob being sneaky and trying to plan things out. God's the one who makes these animals breed, and that's why it's emphasized God's the one who blessed them. He's the one in charge of genetics and reproductive biology. So knowing that just like Abimelech, when he tried to take advantage of Abraham by stealing all of his wells, Laban tried to get a one-up on him by saying, all right, Jacob, you're paid with the most unlikely breeding processes possible. And then God said, okay, well, I'll make it so those animals are going to breed more populously than anyone other before it, or any of the other flocks like it. And that all the babies that you have on your end of the deal, they'll be the weak ones. You try and cheat my kid, I'll treat him. You try and treat my son, then I won't cheat you. God fulfills his promises. And we could know this in spite of who's being talked about here, because let's be honest, this is the most messed up family that I have ever seen in my life. I mean, this may as well be an ABC sitcom. But isn't that the most beautiful thing? God doesn't depend on us to be good people. He's good, and he has enough to share. Thank you for your time listening to this study. If you have any questions or would like to know more about what we talked about, make sure they're sincere, because I know this is a funny topic, but if you have sincere things you'd like to know more about what's been discussed, leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe. It's a great encouragement. And most importantly, if you know someone who probably hasn't heard these passages before and thinks the Bible is boring, share this with them. See if you can bless them and be a part of this ministry and getting the gospel out to our fan bases and our friends and family. Thank you for your time listening to this study. Remember, God loves you.